This is part 3 of chapter 9. We're picking up with the third bullet point here. U.S. firms are going to win from migration of Mexican immigrants into the U.S. Initially, before the migration, we're at WU and we're at E, American workers. As those Mexicans enter the U.S., if you recall shifting the supply curve to the right, they're driving down the wage to WE, and the Mexican workers are adding to the U.S. labor market. So you're getting EF, Mexican immigrants. The result of this is U.S. firms now have more workers, E to F, that are generating a value of marginal product, represented by B to C, and the firms are paying them WE. So this area here from B to C to G is representing the additional value that the firm accrues from the employment of those workers, those migrants from Mexico. So we could shade this area in, kind of highlight that gain. At the same time, the U.S. firms now have lower wages for their American workers. Remember, 0 to E American workers were there before the Mexicans came in, and they're there after the Mexican migrants come in. So they're still working in the U.S., but they're now getting a lower wage. And that's represented from WU down to WE for each of these workers, 0 to E. And we can shade that area in a little bit here, kind of highlight the gain that the firm in the U.S. gets. The U.S. firm is gaining not only in additional workers from Mexico, but they're also gaining by paying lower wages for U.S. workers, which is WU, B, G, WE, okay, this area here. Overall, though, American firms gain this entire sliver in our graph. So U.S. firms win. Now, I want you to notice that this area of lower wages for American workers, while that represents a gain to U.S. firms, that is actually a loss to U.S. workers. So that's this bullet here. So U.S. workers lose WUBGWE, WUBGWE, and that's what U.S. firms win. That's where some of the controversy comes in, because U.S. firms have a strong incentive to attract immigrants from Mexico, because they not only get this additional output from the workers, but they also end up paying lower wages. But U.S. workers are more resistant to immigrants coming from Mexico because they represent competition and drive down wages. Now let's shift over here and look at what happens in Mexico. Well, overall, Mexican firms are going to lose. Here's why. Our initial equilibrium is at WM and L. As those Mexicans workers migrate to the U.S., the supply curve, if you recall, is shifting up to the left and creating a new equilibrium at WE and K. So Mexico is losing these workers, KL, but these workers were adding value. They were adding value based on their value of marginal product demand of this amount. And the Mexican firms were paying them WM, this amount. So the Mexican firms were actually getting this area here, which is IJM. But they're not getting that anymore because these Mexican workers have left to go to the US. So that's a loss to Mexican firms. At the same time, Mexican firms have to pay their remaining Mexican workers, 0 to K, a higher wage. And that's represented by the new higher wage for Mexican workers and the old market wage. So this area here is a loss to Mexican firms as a result of those Mexicans leaving to work in the U.S. Now you'll notice this area is WM, WE, I, and M. So this area here is the additional wages paid to remaining Mexican workers, whereas this area, IJM, is the lost productivity that comes from those Mexican migrants that leave Mexico. Overall, though, this entire area is lost to Mexican firms. You'll notice that this area here, WM to WEIM, is a loss to Mexican firms, but it's also a gain to Mexican workers. Okay, so the same area that is lost to Mexican firms is gained to Mexican workers. Of course it is. These workers that remain in Mexico now get a higher wage. The other thing to note is the effect on the immigrants that actually leave Mexico and go to the US. Remember, these workers in Mexico, L to K, they're leaving and they're going to the US and becoming E to F. They're winners because they wouldn't do this unless there was a gain. However, this gain to them is not an externality because it's affecting the decision maker. Externalities are benefits or costs that affect third parties that are not decision makers. Notice up to this point, we've talked about U.S. firms, U.S. workers, Mexican firms, Mexican workers. These are all external to the decision makers, which are the migrants that say, I'm going to leave Mexico and go to the U.S. They're the ones that are making the decision and affecting third parties. But for them, these are not externalities. Their gains are what we would say internal, not external. What do they win? Well, they leave Mexico, so they do lose something. These workers from L to K, they were getting paid WM, and that means this area here is now lost to them because they left Mexico. You can kind of shade that in and see the area lost to them. It's just the wage, market wage, times the number of workers that have left. Okay. But where are they going? Well, they're going to the US. So they're becoming EF, and they're getting paid this amount, the market wage. So this area here becomes the gain to them. Well, you can see the incentive because the gains outweigh the losses. The gain of let me do this right, EGCF is greater than the loss of KWMJL. You would be very rational to take this over this, and that's really just to say that Mexican workers leave low-paying Mexico to get higher-paying jobs in the US. There are other spillover effects that should be considered. One is increased congestion and crime in the U.S. So as migrants come from Mexico to the U.S., population density increases, leading to all sorts of issues, more traffic, and more crime. Don't misunderstand, that's not to suggest that Mexicans that come into Mexico have any more criminal tendencies than people in the US, but it's just to say that when you increase the population of a country or a city, an area, you're going to have more congestion and more crime, no matter who those migrants are. The second spillover effect is the brain drain from Mexico. This is often forgotten, but it's really important because as workers leave Mexico to come to the U.S. for the higher paying jobs, Mexico is losing the talent, the future productivity of those workers. It's a resource and it's leaving the country. Labor is considered the most important resource in a country. So to lose that tends to compromise overall economic growth and the standard of living for other people. Keep that in mind because when we produce in an economy, we produce more value than we actually take in wages. You can prove this because no one would hire you if you didn't produce more value than you take, because they wouldn't be able to profit off of you. So the fact that we produce more value as workers than we actually take in wages implies that if Mexican workers are leaving to go to the US, Mexico is losing the benefits that were going to other people from those workers. Another spillover effect is with public assistance programs, things like welfare, where the destination nation, say the US, might now be absorbing more people migrants into these programs. So these programs often have a very limited, it's like a pie. They have a limited amount of money. And if you bring more people in, the slices get smaller. That would be an external effect on Americans who are on those social programs. But if you think of the public assistance programs in Mexico, you have a certain pie. And if people are leaving, then the slices are getting bigger. So that could be a benefit to those people in Mexico that are on those programs. Another thing to consider is lower U.S. wages. We saw in the graph previously that as Mexicans migrate to the U.S. to work here, they do lower U.S. wages. But those lower wages do not occur for all U.S. workers. It really depends on whether the Mexicans represent gross substitutes for American workers or gross complements. For example, if you work in construction, Mexican workers that come here with that skill set might be a gross substitute. You're competing with them, your wages might go down. But if you work in upper management, you might find that the lower wages that come about for the company actually increase profitability for the company, and your bonus is bigger. So those Mexican workers, they're not competing with you, they're not a substitute, they're actually complementary to your wages. So it really depends on your position. Not everybody in the U.S. is affected the same by migration. Those that are going to be affected most adversely are those that see competition for their job coming in. So what is the effect on immigrants in terms of wages? Well, studies have shown that a 10% increase in immigrants tends to cause a 1% decrease in domestic wages. Immigrant wage disparity. In the past, immigrants have reached parity within 10 to 15 years, but recently that has not been the case, and it may have to do with the type of workers that are coming to the U.S. If people come to the U.S., there's two effects. One, you have to say, well, that's a huge undertaking. So you've got this self-selection of people that are maybe more motivated, more hardy. I mean, they're usually going to another country. Maybe they don't speak the language. Maybe there's all this assimilation they have to do, and they're willing to do that. So that brings more productive people into the country, and you would expect that to raise wages. But at the same time, they may have these language barriers that limit their upward mobility. They may have legal barriers. We have a large population of people that are undocumented, and those people, even if they're really smart and really productive, they may not be able to move up to their potential because of documentation issues. So there are a lot of factors that probably go into migrants not reaching parity with Americans. There is a good book you can read. It's called The Millionaire Next Door. And that book talks about how immigrants in the past have actually done better than Americans have done. So it supports the idea that this effect, self-selected migrants, may be a powerful enough effect to offset some of those other challenges migrants face. Lastly, I want to talk about the impact of capital and product flows. For this example, we're going to use Korea. In the left-hand graph, we have the U.S. Labor market, and let's say the supply is vertical, and South Korea over here, supply is vertical. Well, if currently there's high wages in the U.S., say the wages are at WU, okay, where demand intersects supply here, and in Korea, wages are low, demand intersects supply here. So start out at WU in the US and WK in Korea. Well, if you don't allow labor to flow, I mean, you would say, well, Koreans would want to come to the US, right? Just like Mexicans would come here. They want to leave the low wage environment to go to the high wage environment. But maybe we don't allow that. Maybe it's too far for people to go. Maybe oceans apart tends to prevent labor flows more than just having a land border. But on top of that, there may be other restrictions to coming to the U.S. So maybe we can't move labor. What's interesting is if you don't move labor, capital will move. So what's going to happen is American firms are going to see these low wages in Korea, and they're going to want to take advantage of them. And so they're going to move a lot of their capital to Korea. Another way of putting it is American firms are going to build factories in Korea. What's that going to do? Well, it's actually going to make Korean workers more productive. So the demand curve is going to shift up, moving wages up in Korea. And as the capital flows out of the US, the demand curve is going to move down, decreasing the wages of Americans. In other words, capital is going to flow. until wages are at parity. Now, Korea is by no means an extremely low-wage country, but historically it has been. And so part of their improvement has been about capital flowing into that country because of the low wages, bringing about more parity that we see today in Korea and the US. Okay, that's it, guys. Hope this helps. And I think that wraps up Chapter 9.